Imagine being forced to wear a metal mask shaped like a pig, just for gossiping. Sounds unbelievable, right? But in medieval Europe, this was real life. Welcome to our channel. Today, we're diving into some of the strangest and most shocking punishments people faced during medieval times. From uncomfortable masks to public embarrassment, you won't believe how people were disciplined centuries ago. The shame mask, silencing voices in metal cages. What if you were punished just for speaking your mind, not with words, but with a mask made of cold iron that forced your mouth shut? Sounds like a movie scene, right? But this was real punishment in medieval Europe. It was called the brank, or more commonly, the Scold's Bridle, and it was as cruel as it was bizarre. What was the Scold's Bridle? In the 16th and 17th centuries, especially in countries like England, Scotland, and parts of Germany, women could be punished simply for talking too much. If a woman was labeled as a scold, meaning she was too loud, opinionated, or argumentative, she could be forced to wear the brank. This device was a metal cage or frame that fit tightly over the head like a helmet. But it wasn't just for show. Inside the bridle was a metal plate or spike that pressed down on the person's tongue. If they tried to speak or shout, the plate would dig into their tongue, causing pain and stopping them from talking. The message was simple. You talk too much. Now you can't talk at all. Public humiliation was the goal. The brank wasn't used privately or quietly. In fact, it was made for public embarrassment. Once the woman was locked into the device, she was often paraded around the town by a rope or chain. People would come out of their homes to stare, laugh, and sometimes throw garbage or insults at her. To make things worse, some branks had bells attached to the top, so every time the woman moved her head, the bells would ring, alerting everyone nearby that a scold was coming. It was meant to humiliate the victim as much as possible. Some versions of the brank were even shaped like animals, such as pigs or donkeys, to mock the woman and send a message that she was foolish or wild. These punishments were not just physical, they were emotional attacks meant to silence women and teach others to be quiet and obedient. Why mostly women? The brank was almost always used on women. In medieval society, women were expected to be quiet, submissive, and obedient. If they argued with their husbands, complained about neighbors, or spoke out in public, they could easily be labeled as scolds. Men who caused trouble were often punished in different ways, but for women, simply using their voice too much was sometimes enough to bring punishment. The brank was a symbol of power and control, not justice. A glimpse of the past. Today, it's hard to imagine such a cruel punishment being accepted, but back then, this was seen as normal, even by courts and local governments. Historical records show that the brank was used in towns across Europe, often approved by judges or town officials. Some women were forced to wear the mask for hours or even days, sometimes while tied to a post in the middle of the town square. Today, branks can be found in museums, reminding us of a time when free speech, especially for women, was not allowed. Final thoughts on the brank. The Scold's Bridle may seem like something from a nightmare, but it was once a very real part of life. It shows us how cruel the past could be, and how far we've come in terms of human rights, gender equality, and freedom of expression. Thankfully, we now live in a world where people are encouraged to speak up, not forced into silence. The ducking stool, when water became a weapon. Imagine being tied to a chair, lowered into freezing water again and again, not because you broke a law, but simply because people thought you were annoying, or even a witch. Sounds cruel, right? But in medieval Europe, this wasn't a rare horror story. It was a punishment called the ducking stool, and many unfortunate people, especially women, had to face it in front of angry crowds. What was the ducking stool? The ducking stool was a strange-looking chair, often made of wood or iron, that was attached to a long wooden beam or placed on a special frame near a river, pond, or lake. The person being punished, usually a woman, would be tied tightly to the chair, unable to move. Then, using ropes or levers, she would be lowered into the water, sometimes completely submerged. and then pulled back up, only to be dunked again. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was terrifying, humiliating, and often dangerous. Who was punished with it? The ducking stool was mainly used to punish scolds, women accused of nagging or arguing too much, wives who were seen as disobedient, suspected witches, people accused of lying, cheating, or disturbing the peace. It didn't matter if the person had broken a real law. Even just being unpopular could lead to this punishment. Sometimes it was ordered by local courts, but other times it was done by village mobs who wanted to shame someone publicly. Simply put, if someone didn't fit in, they could end up on the ducking stool. The cold truth. How it was done. The chair was usually placed on a long wooden beam that extended out over the water like a giant seesaw. Once the person was strapped in, they were slowly dunked into the water. How many times? It depended. Some were dipped 3 or 4 times, others even more. The idea was to cool off their bad behavior, especially if the person was angry or argumentative. In the case of suspected witches, people believed that if the woman floated, she was guilty because water would reject her. If she sank, she was innocent. But sadly, many who sank were never rescued in time. That means this punishment could be both painful and deadly, even if the person had done nothing wrong. A tool of shame, not justice. The ducking stool wasn't just about punishment. It was also about embarrassing the person in front of their entire community. Crowds would gather at the riverside to watch and cheer. Some people even treated it like entertainment, bringing their children to see the show. But for the person tied to the stool, it was pure fear and humiliation. Wet, cold, and exposed to everyone, they had no way to defend themselves or even speak. It wasn't about justice, it was about control and public shaming. Real cases from history. One famous record from 17th century England describes a woman named Dorothy Waugh, who was ducked because she refused to stop preaching. She was tied and dunked multiple times in a public river. Dorothy survived, but many others did not. In some towns, ducking stools were built into bridges, so they were always ready to use. That shows just how common and accepted this punishment once was. Lessons from the ducking stool. Today, the idea of punishing someone like this sounds shocking. We now recognize that everyone has the right to speak, complain, or express their thoughts without being tortured or humiliated. The ducking stool is a symbol of a time when fear, judgment, and cruelty were disguised as discipline. Thankfully, it's now a piece of history and a reminder that justice should never be based on fear, gender, or gossip. Stocks and pillories, trapped in shame. Imagine standing for hours, locked by your hands or head in a wooden frame, while the entire town mocks you, and you can't move an inch. Welcome to the world of stocks and pillories, 2 of the most popular forms of public punishment in medieval Europe, and while they may look simple, their impact was powerful and often humiliating. What were stocks and pillories? Stocks and pillories were both wooden devices used to restrain people in a public place, but they worked slightly differently. Stocks were made of 2 wooden boards with holes for your ankles. You would sit on the ground or a bench, legs stretched out, locked in place. Pillories, on the other hand, had holes for your head and hands. You stood upright, bent forward, with your neck and wrists trapped between the wooden boards. In both cases, you couldn't escape. You couldn't move. You couldn't cover your face or protect yourself. You were completely exposed, and that was exactly the point. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about shame. Who was sentenced to the stocks? Stocks and pillories were used across Europe for minor crimes, such as stealing, lying, selling bad or overpriced goods, cheating in business, public drunkenness, blasphemy, or swearing, and even skipping church. These weren't crimes that got you executed or jailed for years, but the goal was to make an example out of you. Let everyone see what happens if you break the rules, was the message. a spectacle for the public. These devices were usually placed in central town areas, near the market, a church, or the main road. Why? Because that's where everyone would see you. Once someone was locked in, they were left there for hours, sometimes even a full day. Crowds would gather, not just to watch, but to mock, laugh, and throw things. Yes, people would throw rotten vegetables, mud, even stones at the person. Children would laugh, strangers would yell insults, and the person being punished had no way to defend themselves. This wasn't just a penalty, it was public humiliation on display. Physical and mental toll. While stocks and pillories may sound less harsh than other medieval punishments, they were far from easy. Standing or sitting still for hours caused severe pain and cramps. The person might be exposed to rain, snow, or hot sun. Cuts and bruises from thrown objects were common. And worst of all, the emotional damage. Being ridiculed by your community, your neighbors, even your own friends, could hurt more than anything physical. For many, the shame lasted much longer than the sentence. Real-life use. Stocks and pillories were used in England, France, Germany, and even in early America during the colonial period. In fact, some were still used as recently as the 1700s and 1800s. One famous case was Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe, who was put in the pillory in 1703 for writing something the government didn't like. But instead of being attacked, people cheered for him and threw flowers, showing that public opinion could sometimes work the other way too. What we can learn, stocks and pillories were meant to punish, but also to control. They reminded everyone, obey the rules or suffer public disgrace. Today, we see how wrong it was to use shame as justice. People deserve fair trials, privacy, and a chance to grow, not to be broken down in front of a crowd. These devices may now rest in museums, but they remind us of a time when justice wasn't always fair, and punishment often came with a crowd of laughter. The heretic's fork, silenced by steel. What if simply questioning authority could land you with a metal spike under your chin, so sharp, so close, that you couldn't speak, swallow, or sleep? This wasn't a horror movie. It was a real punishment used in medieval Europe, and it was called the heretic's fork. What was the heretic's fork? The heretic's fork was a metal rod, usually about 8 to 12 inches long, with two sharp prongs on each end, like a two-headed fork. It wasn't used to pierce someone, not directly. Instead, it was used to hold them in complete silence and discomfort. Here's how it worked. One end of the fork was placed under the chin, and the other was pressed into the chest, or in some cases, under the jaw and into the upper chest or collarbone. The device was then strapped to the person's neck with a leather collar so that any movement, even the slightest nod, would cause pain. You couldn't talk. You couldn't move your head. You couldn't even fall asleep without stabbing yourself. It was a punishment of silence, control, and fear. Who were the heretics? To understand the heretic's fork, we need to understand the word heretic. In medieval Europe, especially during the time of the Inquisition, the Church held great power. People who questioned religious teachings, spoke against the Church, or followed different beliefs were labeled heretics, and being a heretic wasn't just frowned upon, it was seen as dangerous, even criminal. Authorities believed that heresy could spread and weaken the Church's control, so they created punishments meant to scare people into staying silent. The heretic's fork became a symbol of this fear, a tool used to force people into obedience. The psychology behind the pain. The heretic's fork wasn't meant to cause bloody wounds or instant injury. Instead, it was used to create mental torture through discomfort, fear, and silence. The person wearing it had to stay completely still. No talking, no whispering, no shouting. Even swallowing was risky. The constant fear of being stabbed by the sharp ends of the fork kept the victim in a state of anxiety and pain. In many cases, this device was used during interrogations. It forced the accused to listen, but not speak. Even begging for mercy could hurt. This was a punishment not of the body, but of the mind, and for many that was even worse. Used with other restraints. The heretic's fork was often combined with other forms of restraint. Victims were tied to walls, pillars, or chairs, left immobile and helpless. To ensure the fork stayed in place, a tight leather belt or iron collar was locked around the neck. Some were even gagged or blindfolded to increase the feeling of isolation. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about control and sending a strong message: don't speak, don't resist. Historical use and decline. While the heretic's fork wasn't as widespread as stocks or ducking stools, it was used in Spain, Italy, and parts of France during the medieval Inquisition, a period when church courts actively hunted and punished heresy. As time passed and people began to value freedom of thought, freedom of religion, and human rights, punishments like the heretic's fork were viewed as inhumane and eventually banned. Today, examples of these devices are seen in museums as part of medieval torture displays, not to celebrate them, but to remind us how dangerous it is when power goes unchecked. Final thoughts. The heretic's fork was more than a piece of iron. It was a weapon of silence, a way to stop ideas, beliefs, and voices that didn't follow the rules of the time. Thankfully, we now live in a world where questioning, thinking differently, and speaking freely is a human right, not a crime. The drunkard's cloak, a barrel full of shame. Imagine being forced to wear a giant wooden barrel like a dress, walking through your town while everyone pointed, laughed, and insulted you. That's not a cartoon punishment. It was very real. It was called the drunkard's cloak, and it was one of the strangest ways medieval Europe dealt with public drunkenness. A punishment for drinking too much. In medieval times, alcohol was a common part of daily life. Clean water wasn't always easy to find, so people often drank beer or ale, even with breakfast. But just like today, some people took it too far, getting drunk in public, causing fights, yelling in the streets, or disturbing peace in small towns and villages. And for them, punishment came in the form of public humiliation, not jail time, but something worse, being made a walking joke in front of your entire community. What exactly was the drunkard's cloak? The drunkard's cloak was literally a large wooden barrel, the same kind used to store wine or ale. The bottom was cut out, and 2 holes were made in the sides for the arms. The person being punished was forced to wear it like clothing, with the heavy barrel hanging from their shoulders down to their knees or ankles. They couldn't sit, they couldn't walk properly, and to make things worse, they were paraded through town, made to walk through markets, streets, and sometimes even churches, while people laughed, threw things, or shouted names and insults. It was punishment through shame, not pain. Public shaming as a lesson. The idea behind the drunkard's cloak was not just to punish the person, but to warn others. Don't be like this, or you'll be next. Towns believed that mockery and embarrassment would stop people from repeating the same behavior, and in small medieval communities, where reputation mattered deeply, this kind of punishment could stick with someone for years. Imagine walking past the same people who laughed at you while you wore a barrel. Imagine trying to go back to work or to the local inn, knowing everyone saw you as a joke. That was the real weight of the drunkard's cloak, not the wood, but the memory. Where was it used? The drunkard's cloak was especially common in England and parts of Germany during the 1600s and 1700s. Records show that towns like Newcastle used this punishment regularly. In fact,
Some German towns took it even further. They would paint messages or draw images on the barrel, cartoon faces, devil horns, or labels like town drunk, to make the punishment more ridiculous. It wasn't about justice, it was about public control through laughter. Humiliation instead of healing. Today, we know that excessive drinking is often linked to addiction, stress, or personal struggles. But back then, there was no understanding of mental health or alcohol dependence. Instead of helping people, society chose to shame them. Instead of offering support, they offered a barrel and a parade of laughter. It's a reminder of how far we've come, and how important it is to treat people with compassion, not cruelty. From metal masks to water dunkings, from painful silence to public shame, the punishments of medieval Europe were often more about embarrassment and fear than true justice. Thankfully, we no longer live in a time where you could be punished just for speaking too loudly, drinking too much, or questioning authority. But these stories remind us of something important. When punishment becomes entertainment, humanity is lost. So, which of these punishments shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments. We're reading, everyone. If you found this video fascinating, hit that like button, subscribe for more weird and forgotten history, and don't forget to share it with a friend who loves bizarre facts. More chilling history stories are on the way. Until then, stay curious and stay kind.